Hello, everyone, and welcome to the week ahead. This week, we are moving through some interesting territory. We're beginning the week. Venus is in the sign of Leo, and she's traveling there with Mars. Leo is a sign that's ruled naturally by the sun. And the sun is in the sign of Cancer, which is ruled naturally by the moon. So we have this really interesting dynamic where Venus and Mars are both responding to sun and moon. They're responding to the luminaries, and they are both reflecting the changeable nature. Sun and moon are always working in relationship to one another. And if we think about how the moon grows in light over a period of time, like the other night was the first night that I really saw the moon in the sky after the new moon that we just had in Gemini. It takes a few days before there's a little sliver of light in the sky. And then progressively, there's more and more illumination. And with Venus and Mars together in the sign of Leo, there's something that we're learning about our essential joy, our childhood, maybe our creative power, our strength, that may be a slow process of illumination, right? We have Venus, who's going to go all the way to the end of Leo, get to 28 degrees, and then station retrograde, and she'll spend about 4 months total in the sign of Leo. And this direct time is a very important time. And it's important especially because when we're thinking about Venus right now, she's the ruler of the North Node. Now, that will only be the case for about another month. In a little less than a month, the nodes of the moon are going to be shifting signs so that the North Node moves into the sign of Aries and the South Node moves into the sign of Libra, which means that Venus goes from ruling the North Node in the sign of Taurus to ruling the South Node. And that's an important part of our evolutionary journey. Right now, it's so much about the very pieces of us that we are reclaiming. And in that reclamation, in that return to self, return to heart, in that process of our growing, there's a real opportunity to shift our identity around our lives, around, what it is that we desire, around our own creative outlets, and especially around relationship. And one of the things I was reflecting on earlier today is how often the environment and the container of our relationships becomes the context or the structure through which our identities are formed. So, for example, if you grew up in a deeply religious household and you're raised with these very specific traditions and rituals and beliefs and practices, that becomes the container in which your identity is formed. Likewise, if you were raised in a household where there was no religion practice whatsoever and no talk of God, no experience of spirituality, maybe a more scientific background, then in that container, your identity is formed. Now, most of us are forming our original identities through the lens of sun and moon, mother, father, Cancer, Capricorn, the structures of our life. become these foundational places. And so then if we're in a relationship with, you know, where we're in a relational container where we're being taught different ways of being, different ways of relating, different things that are socially acceptable, considered okay or not okay, right? Uranus is in Taurus right now, so that, and the Venus, Mars right now is making the square to Uranus, right? Breaking free from the status quo. And then Venus will be moving in this next week towards her square to Uranus. In order for us to claim a new identity, we actually have to break free of certain relational patterns or expressionary patterns or, physical patterns, limitations, embodiment patterns in order to experience something new. So one of the things I was thinking about was having to really being like relationships kind of being the limit. If a partnership or a marriage, if you're not really allowed to be anything other than, pleasing to your partner or doing things that they would like, doing things that they would appreciate, that part of the identity, the self-value, self-love, right, will be entirely dependent upon what it is that they desire, what it is that they want, what it is that they think is valuable or important or special. And if we've grown up in a way where we've naturally been limited in our self-expression, we might have to leave our family system or leave a relationship or leave the town that we grew up in order to feel the sense of freedom to be ourselves, and or leave the religion that we belong to, right? And in that breaking free, then there becomes a breaking apart of the identity structure and the relational structure. And maybe the next relationship that comes along, we find someone who has more of the same likes that we have, or we follow our own spiritual path and discover the truths that feel most aligned with what our heart is, or we find our creative path. In all of these things, there's a development process, similar to the way that the sun and the moon work in development of growth and growing light, right? You could think of the new moon as the newborn seed, and the new seed is the most tender place. It is it's most common that a woman will lose a child or have a miscarriage in the first 9 weeks or in the first 20 weeks. In the earlier parts of the pregnancy, it's much more vulnerable. And then, as a baby is growing up in the early days of being a newborn, its whole identity is relying upon the love, care, and nourishment of the mother. And then as it grows and develops more and more individualism and autonomy, until the point at which, between 3 and 5 years old, often they are potty trained, they can do their own thing, they can have their own ideas, and yet there is still a limitation in their childness, innocence, that still requires the guidance of a parent for really the entirety of a child's lifetime, and especially all the way through adolescence and until graduating and going off to college, and then 18 you're becoming an adult. And even then we go through very similar cycles of individuation, right? 18 to the first Saturn return, I would say is the same type of cycle. From like 18 to 21 is kind of like 0 to 3 years old all over again. And then 21 to, I don't know, 25 is kind of like, 4 to 12 years old. There's all this incremental growth and maturing until you get all the way around to 30, which is kind of like, getting to 18 again. These are growth cycles. But in each of those cycles, the identity and what we feel, the relationships we feel attracted to, the desires that we have to cultivate in our life, and our individual self-expression will be growing, expanding, and developing. And then how we learn to be in relationship to another. What happens to ourselves when people don't agree with our ideas or when they don't feel the same way? And I went to this interfaith brunch this morning with the synagogue in our local town, and there was this beautiful dialogue amongst couples who were interfaith couples. Some were Jewish and some were, in every single couple, there was a pairing of two individuals from very different faith backgrounds, very different upbringings, very different beliefs, ideas, and also finding their way how to be with one another. And I think that that is very reflective of this Venus Mars. Venus and Mars are traveling together, right? In the sign of Leo. They're going to be together for quite a while before Mars enters Virgo and then Venus stations retrograde, and she'll make, the longer cycle through Leo. But during this time, especially, they are in this relationship to the sun and the moon. So there's this growing illumination, especially as we see the moon move into the sign of Libra, where we're learning how to communicate. Communicate what? Our desires, the emotional needs that we have, what is required in relationship in order to feel nourished, cared for, and protected. You can see that Juno is in the sign of Cancer now. She's begun a new phase in her journeys and moving into a trine with the South Node and really traveling close to the sun. She's also ruled by the moon right now and ruled by Venus. So there's something new that we're committing to in terms of our own self-care and self-value. And this may have to do with really saying, well, this is what I desire. This was what I want. But how do we then find the balance where we're also letting go of the fears, the distrust, the judgments, the feelings of restriction, oppression, even the parts of ourselves that we have suppressed because we don't know whether or not they're worthy of love. And one way to really start attending to those things, because I still feel like there's so much relative to the unknown. I know that I felt a lot of despair and grief this week in my relationship, and it really took me by surprise. I thought, well, we have this beautiful new moon, and I have such I was so in touch with my desires, and my heart and what it is that I'm wanting for my life, I'm gonna cry. What I'm calling in. And then I came up against this same dynamic in my relationship where my partner doesn't want the same things as me. And, he doesn't share the same calling in his heart. And I can respect that. I can completely understand where that comes from. and even find myself working more and more on how to detach or let go, and really learning how to love him and totally accept him exactly as he is, exactly where he is. And it still brings up immense grief to feel like I have these desires in my heart and I'm not with someone who shares those same desires. Wow, I wasn't expecting that. And a part of what I've been learning is not to leave the path of love. To let go more and more of the attachments that I have, or the expectations, the feelings that things should be different, to really continue to develop and cultivate my trust and my faith in that my desires, the longings that I have are there for a reason, and they, like I haven't been able to let them go. And that they will find their fulfillment in my faith. Yeah. And this is a part of learning how to walk in a way in relationship where people don't always share the same desires that we have. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. That doesn't mean that they're bad. You know, I don't know whether it means what the relationship, what the outcome, Uranus, breaks things up. Often our awareness can change in a moment of insight that can help to heal things. Obviously everything I believe on this journey is a part of a healing path ultimately. And as we move through this lunar cycle where the growing light of the moon is taking us into this first quarter square, the first quarter square can bring through those challenges of where we have to change in relationship to another without changing ourselves, without giving up our needs. And so I've been learning so much more this week about codependency and attachment theory and healing, really healing. And I think that the Venus activation that we're receiving in the sign of Leo is so deeply about healing the heart and allowing the masculine to be the masculine and the feminine to be the feminine, allowing our desires and what drives us to be true to our joy and to our, creative inspiration, allowing our expression to not be restricted or oppressed by what we think about the other person. So much of what we can imagine in relationship has more to do about what we think about people or what we think that people think, and less to do with the actuality of, who people are, what people are bringing forward in our lives. And that can sometimes be really disillusioning if, we've been in a relationship and we believe something about a way someone feels about us, and then that, realization that like, oh, maybe they don't feel the same way that we feel in our heart. I know the grief of that one. But I think there can be a lot of healing in learning how to express our needs and staying true to our sovereignty of choice, to our calling to the heart. And that doesn't always mean that we're going to get our needs resolved through another person. And often means that we're going to be coming back to ourselves for that reconnection, dissolving disappointment and distrust and hurt with self-trust and self-actualization and self-realization, healing the heart through forgiving and letting go of the need or the expectation for anyone or anything to be different, right? We have this beautiful grand trine that happens. And this week also, Mercury moves into Cancer. So we finish this time of Mercury in Gemini, and the Mercury Cancer position is Mercury moving into its superior conjunction with the sun. I think this is an incredible time for us to be able to access deeper emotional contents, remnants of a childhood imprinting that we're ready to liberate from in order to experience something new. And in one of the podcast episodes that I listened to this week, they did this like meditation of going back to this 13-year-old self, and I feel like you could go back to any age where you felt like from that point on your growth stunted, or that's the point at which you can recognize we're dealing with sun and moon. So going back to the age that your relationship with your father broke down, or the age that your relationship with your mother broke down. And for some people, that might be 0. Like there may never have been, for others, it may have been something like, I can recognize that my, 3-year-old, 3-year-old self, for, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, like all along the road, there's these little 13, 12, 13, breakdowns, 16, that there's an opportunity in this time period, especially in this week, as we're in Cancer season, to reconnect with the deeper desires of those ages and stages. So like at those ages, I spent a lot of time with adults. I would go to church, and I spent a lot of time hanging out at the church with elders of the church. And, you know, I felt like so much of my desire at that time was like to be a fashion designer and go to Paris, and to be a weather girl or an actress, and to create things and make things and travel. And like, so I've just been like reconnecting with those feelings and those desires, and where they really reflect, the what is the word? It's like the self that hasn't been edited, the child. There are ways in which I watch my children, and I can see how each of them has their own personality, their own things that they gravitate towards before anyone starts telling them who they are or what they are. That's what I mean. And a part of what we can be working with in this week ahead, especially in Venus and Mars dynamics, are the allyship in relationship, of really supporting each other, whether it's your friends or your partner, your husband, your relationship, the ways in which we might feel we have to break away from relationships where there's some part of ourself that can't come out there yet. There's some part of ourself that has to have a new container. And in some ways, we're beginning to form that new container so that that self can be discovered. And in other ways, we're having to go back to the old ways in which Pluto is back in the sign of Capricorn. We're reconnecting with those final old structures. It'll be, in and out of Capricorn the next year and a half, going back into Aquarius and then back into Capricorn, squaring the nodal axis. This particular time, in fact, just the remainder of this month is the end of this Capricorn square to the Taurus Scorpio nodal axis. That won't happen again in our lifetime. That we're going to be, when the next time that cycle comes through of those nodes, Pluto will have, pretty sure Pluto will have already gone through Aquarius entirely, if not be at the very end of that cycle. It's another 19 years before the nodes would be back in Taurus and Scorpio. And it'll be 20 years that Pluto will be in the sign of Aquarius. So this is it, folks, in terms of this last month. In fact, like these last 20 or so days, this is it of Venus ruling the North Node in aspect to this Pluto in Capricorn. And as we get to the end of these cycles, I think that it's because we're planting 20-year seeds. We're uprooting, 248-year seeds. Many of the things that we're contending with were issues of our ancestors, not necessarily even like we're looking at the effects of our ancestors' dreams and longings and desires. That's what our present day reality is. And there are still many aspects of our life that may have only just the seeds of where we'll actually be in the next 20 years, just the tiniest little emergences. So it's a powerful time to be consciously looking at the beliefs and the ideas that have set up the looking at the container, let's say, the environment, the relationships that have set up the identity and the framework and the supports for our desires, because that's the biggest piece that we're in the process of restructuring. That's the biggest place where even after the nodes shift into Aries and Libra, we'll still have Jupiter in Taurus, Uranus in Taurus. Venus will be ruling those. We end this week with Venus square Uranus. We started the week with Mars square Uranus. So this is a simultaneous dance. It's not as though the work that the masculine is doing, the drives, the desires, right? Everyone has Venus and Mars in their chart, regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation or expression. All charts have a Venus and Mars, even if you're a cat or a dog, right? Or an event. Every chart contains this. So we're speaking to the archetypal piece. But if you think of from the traditional rulership of Mars ruling Scorpio, Venus ruling Taurus, we're in this last cycle where Venus anchors the North Node. She squares Uranus. Mars anchors the South Node. He squares Uranus. So there's an evolutionary shift around what we're letting go of, what we're breaking free from, what we're actualizing ourselves through. And then in less than a month's time, that shift will be that Mars is anchoring the North Node in Aries, and we will have Venus anchoring the South Node, and then Pluto squaring those nodes. And I think I'll speak about this a lot more in the coming weeks, and maybe even do another deep dive on the EA Zoom channel about the square to the nodal axis, because this is the point in which the story begins to work at the deeper levels of our being to be transformed. right? We're sort of in that tipping ground into this summertime season, and it's a really powerful shift ahead. So anyways, we are moving towards full moon, Capricorn full moon this week. We end the week with this illumination of both the structures of our life that are, it's sort of, the image I see is the rafters of a house, and you're just pointing your flashlight in the corners and seeing what else still needs work. What else do I still need to clear out of here? What else do I still need to let go of? And simultaneously, while you're doing that, you're looking at the different areas now that they're being cleared out and saying, wow, what would make this space more beautiful? What would make my heart just feel, if I walked into this room and I felt so joyed, like real, the little me that, you know, had a desire to dance, if she walked into the room, what would she want on the walls, or how would she want to dance, and what would the music be like, right? Letting ourselves feel and imagine the desires of our heart as a conscious and daily practice. So I hope you all have a beautiful week. As always, please feel free to leave me your messages in the comments below if something touched your heart. I look forward to seeing you again on the next video. I do these videos weekly, and if you want to be notified, please subscribe to my channel, like this video, and you can also go to astrologywithmichelle.com and get on my mailing list. You'll be notified when I post free classes and events and do my new moon ceremonies. So I hope that you have a beautiful and blessed full moon week ahead. And until then, my friends, bye for now.